Hello, friends, and welcome to the 5th episode of a special weekly witness series introducing Texas Impact's legislative priorities for the next biennium. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week we continue our series with a discussion about important immigration priorities and what Texans of faith can do. During this series, we'll welcome a faith leader to help introduce a section of the legislative priorities and have a conversation about why it's an important priority to the faith community. Then we'll be joined by a member of the Texas Impact team to help us prepare for the policy conversations we'll need to have leading up to the upcoming election season and legislative session. Here with us for the conversation today is Bishop Michael Rinehart with the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and Texas Impact's Executive Director, Bee Moorhead. But before we jump in, we have an important programming note. Y'all, this is the 200th episode of Weekly Witness. We have come so far with this program since it started as Clergy Mondays at the Capitol. We've recorded on my cell phone from all across Texas, spent a few years hosting live episodes at First United Methodist Church in the Murchison Chapel, recorded live from Zoom during a pandemic, and now have our fancy studio and equipment. But along the way, it's been great meeting many of you in person. I had fun connecting with many of you at recent Faith and Democracy events, and we always love hearing from you and taking your feedback. So thanks for being a part of this journey with us. And y'all, I'm looking forward to the next 200 episodes. I feel like we will need an in-person party at number 250, so maybe that can be part of Texas Impact's 50th anniversary celebrations next year. But back to this episode. This is a part of a 10-part series on Texas Impact's legislative priorities. You can find the full set at texasimpact.org, and we hope you'll share both the priorities and this series with your congregation and groups you're involved with. And if you need a refresher on where they come from, the first 2 episodes in the series feature board members and staff talking about just that. So with that, here we go. Our conversation with Bishop Mike Rinehart. Joining us for today's conversation is Bishop Michael Rinehart, Bishop of the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Bishop, every time I talk to you, I am so impressed when I get all of that correct. But thanks for joining us today. How are you feeling?
I'm impressed too, and thank you for inviting me back. You know, it's one thing to get invited, but when you get invited back, that's a real honor.
You're one of our go-tos. I can't remember how many times you've been on, but folks always love it, and I appreciate your willingness.
It's good to see you.
All right, and so we usually do have you on when we're talking about immigration, because this is certainly an area where you have been a national leader, an international leader, and a passion of yours. And as we're going through this Weekly Witness series where we're laying out our legislative priorities, care for migrants is an important priority for Texans of faith, and it's one that you've spent a lot of time on, both personally and through the ELCA. So as a faith leader, let's set some theological foundation for today. Why is this such an important priority for you?
Well, it's an important priority for me for a number of reasons. But first of all, I grew up in a Christian home, immersed in Scripture. And, we read, regularly studied, and I would say, show me one place in the Bible where people aren't on the move. It's hard to find a part of the Bible that isn't about migration. I mean, people are always on the move. Show me a place in Scripture where God doesn't ask someone to move out of their comfort zone. Show me one person.
Right.
And so, from the very beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve expelled from the Garden of Eden. Cain then is banished from there and goes to live in the land of Nod. Abraham and Sarah are commanded by God, go from your kindred and your country to a new land that I will show you. And the same with their kids, all the way down to Joseph, who goes to Egypt. And then the master story of the Old Testament is the Exodus, about Israelites leaving Egypt, escaping slavery, and then traveling in the wilderness for 40 years before they land in Canaan. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fleeing Herod's persecution into Egypt. Pentecost is a multicultural, multinational events with Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Cappadocia, Pontus. I mean, we read that every Pentecost. People of faith know this stuff. The Apostle Paul's always on the move. And then the Scriptures, we know the Scriptures command us to treat the sojourner among us as a native citizen. They even say, don't glean your fields completely. Leave some for the orphan, the widow, and the immigrant. And Jesus, in his apocalypse, has when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. For whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. Hebrews don't refuse to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. So hospitality is a sacred duty. And then second, I would say my home congregation resettled Vietnamese refugees as a kid, and that had a huge impact on my life as we got to know these families, and especially people my own age. When I was a teenagers coming in and telling their stories of what this was like, and that our country and that our church cared for these people. Oh my gosh, that had a huge impact on my life. And then finally, we're in the largest refugee crisis in the world right now. And so it can't help but, I think, be an important issue for the church and for me personally.
Yeah, speaking of the church, one of my favorite meetings every month is I have a chance to sit in on the ELCA State Public Policy Office meetings. And certainly for the ELCA, immigration is an important issue and has been for years, right?
Yep, absolutely. You mentioned that I've been involved in this. I sat on the board of directors for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service for many years, and was chair of the board when we hired Krish Vignaraja as president CEO, and she has taken it to a new level. She's just been dynamite.
Well, you mentioned this refugee crisis that's taking place across the world right now, and the movement of humans from one place to another. And this movement certainly hit home for those of us in Texas recently with the deaths of 53 migrants near San Antonio. And speaking of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, I know they certainly came out with a strong statement in response to that. I feel like we need a little bit of a pastoral word right now about both that situation and how we should respond.
Yeah. Well, anytime we see people suffering, a theology of the cross draws us into that suffering. I mean, that was horrific. 150 miles north of the border, 53 people, and this just kind of highlights our broken immigration system right now. People who are desperate to flee violence, persecution, and poverty in Central America have been marginalized, and the stay in Mexico policy, and opponents of immigration, like our governor here in Texas, who claims we have open borders, even though our borders are more closed than they have ever been in the history of the United States. It just kind of amazed me. Especially because Texas has benefited so much economically from the influx of immigrants who work hard and they start new businesses, and it's been huge for Houston, where I live.
Right.
You get me started about busing people to New York, a political stunt that uses people as pawns in a Machiavellian political game. It's really inhumane and against everything I believe in.
Yeah. So speaking of the governor, we're talking about legislative priorities during this series, and the way the Texas Impact Board handled that this time is there are a lot of issues that we could have positions on. But chose to narrow it down to a handful of priorities that we think are both important to people of faith, but also issues that will move during the legislative session, where there's a need for people of faith to speak out. And I'll say, remembering back to last legislative session, during the session there wasn't a ton of talk about immigration issues, but it seemed like as soon as the session ended, within a few days, we started getting announcements about things like Operation Lone Star and other actions that the governor and others were taking. So how do you respond to the way that the state has been handling this over the course of the last year and a half?
Yeah. Well, of course, everything was really focused on Roe v. Wade kind of stuff, and there were a number of other issues that just kind of pushed that out of the limelight, if you will. It's so hard. It's like it feels like we're always reacting, and I think we need to be more proactive. And so I would just say vote. For heaven's sakes, vote. Find the people that kind of understand what's going on. We have to insist upon what the vast majority of Americans want, what the vast majority of Texans want, what the vast majority of Republicans want: a path to citizenship for those who are here. I mean, survey after survey after survey, even a majority of Trump voters wanted this. And, generous work visas for those who want to come here and work hard and pursue the American dream. That's what we have to be all about.
We're asking our listeners to go meet with their state representatives between now and Election Day and leading up to the legislative session to stake out positions on some of these legislative priorities. If you're advising them, if somebody came and said, "Hey, Bishop, we're meeting with our legislators, we're going to talk about immigration," what do you think the message should be? How would you respond?
State or federal level or both?
Let's start with state, and then I'll give you federal next. I'll let you take both of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to separate them. I always encourage people to go with Texas impact legislative priorities because you guys have worked through that stuff so much. And here's the reality: is that most of this stuff has to be dealt with on a federal level. So I probably shouldn't have even asked. Really, I mean, immigration is a federal policy issue. Mm-hmm. And so the stuff that I keep coming back to is restore asylum.
Right.
And the state can do that. And it seems like it won't. Protecting dreamers. At the federal level right now, I would encourage the Afghan Adjustment Act. I mean, we airlifted a bunch of people out. They came here. They're basically on parole right now. And the next step is for them to apply for SIV visas and special immigrant visas. And because of the visa backlog, I mean, the backlog is huge. It's part of the problem, quite frankly. It's going to take a long time. So this Afghan Adjustment Act will make it possible for them to apply for some permanent status within a year and so forth, which makes their lives a lot better. If they're here, we want them to be able to integrate. We want them to be able to work. We want them to be able to go to school and do the things that their families need to do. And then I guess another thing that we're really pushing for, and this is not federal legislation, this is a presidential determination, is for the Biden administration to set the refugee ceiling at 200,000 for next year. That's something we really want to encourage. Haven't been that high since the beginning of the Reagan years.
There has been a lot of federal action over the course of the last few weeks. Congress has moved many important bills forward, but I haven't been hearing as much about immigration. Do you have any hope? Any hope that anything will happen there, or just thinking that we're looking for executive actions?
I have hope. I think that stuff is going to happen. I think people are beginning to realize that it's not enough to depend upon this presidential order and that presidential order because those change the president. We're going to need legislation to do it. And I've seen some, yeah. So, I mean, the fact that we were able to come together on a gun violence bill that, people on the far left and the far right were unhappy with. But this is what government has to do, is learn how to compromise and come to something that everybody can live with to some extent. And I think we've seen some hopeful signs of possibility. We've also seen an increase in resettlement. I mean, the last 10 years have seen the gutting of our refugee organizations because the ceiling was set so low that there wasn't work. People had to find other work. We lost staffing, skilled staffing, and now even though the ceiling has gone up, everybody's having to rebuild their staffs, and that's a real challenge. But at least it's going back up, and the U.S. needs to do its part in helping deal with this global refugee crisis. And then I guess another thing that gives me hope, and this goes back a little ways, but remember when there was the separation of parents from their children at the border, that whole separation policy, the fact that Americans just rose up and had a fit so that the government had to change its policy gives me great hope that people of goodwill are going to step up at some point and say, enough, we need to move on.
Amen. I love all of that. We are a public policy podcast, and so we typically focus on that. But you've also mentioned resettlement a couple of times, and I wonder if you might want to say a word about how individuals and congregations can support resettlement efforts.
Yeah, well, find your local resettlement organization and work with them. Here in Houston, we have Refugee Services of Texas. We have Interfaith Ministries. I'm sitting on their board right now, and they do phenomenal work. There are a number, I think there's about 5 organizations, including the Y, that are doing refugee resettlement. And all of them have some kind of volunteer constituent program. And I'll tell you what, the government says, okay, you resettle this refugee family. They can have 1 fork per person, 1 spoon, 1 knife. You can have 1 couch for a family, 1 table. I mean, that kind of stuff. It's fairly minimal. But when a faith community or just good neighbors of goodwill gather around these families, all of a sudden you see TVs showing up, you see other things showing up that are part of life. I mean, it doesn't include a car. I mean, finding transportation. We have an organization here in Houston called Free Wheels that provides free bicycles for immigrants. There are a lot of ways to help out. You just got to get plugged in with those organizations, and look around you. And in many cases, there are folks moving in right by you, and just be a good neighbor, for heaven's sakes.
Be a good neighbor, for heaven's sakes. Love it. Bishop, you mentioned hope.
For Jesus' sake, be a good neighbor.
There we go. So as we start to close out, you mentioned hope. And I'm asking all of the faith leaders throughout the series, it is a hard time right now. There are people who are discouraged. There are people who are scared. There are people who are disheartened, like all of the things with what's going on in our democracy and throughout the world. What word of hope would you have to leave us with today?
Yeah, if you look at what the general public wants, and I don't have the surveys in front of me, but just go to Pew or some other statistical organization where they're asking a broad sample of U.S. Americans what they want to see happen with regards to immigration policy, with regards to those who are already here. As I've said before, a vast majority of them want goodwill. They want people to be able to pursue the American dream. They just don't want crime. So what they really want to do is have a government that is really carefully focused on saying we're gonna be very careful about screening those who come into the country. But as we know, the vast majority of people are just here to work, and they love their families and they want to provide for their families. And I think the majority of Americans recognize that, and they want that for everyone. And I believe that with all my heart.
Amen. Well, Bishop, really appreciate the time today. Any shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with?
Yes, absolutely. Love your neighbor as yourself. That would be my shameless plug.
Love it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, Bishop Mike, really appreciate the time and appreciate all you're doing to make the world a better place. Thanks again.
Good to be with you. God bless.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us again for today's response is Texas Impact's Executive Director, Bee Moorhead. Hey, Bee.
Hey, Scott. How you doing?
I am fabulous, and I'm fabulous in part because today we are recording our 200th episode of Weekly Witness. That seems like a pretty big accomplishment. I'm waiting for the cake.
That is astonishing. I'm so proud of us.
Did you ever think we'd get here when we were setting up with my cell phone 2 or 3, 4 years ago, however long ago that was?
I could not have imagined it, and I could not be prouder of you. You have really captained this ship of podcast all the way to where we are now, where people you don't even know are telling you how much they like your podcast.
That was fun this weekend. Wasn't searching for compliments there, but it has been a fun team effort over the course of the years, and so many great guests, and so many great listeners who've given us feedback. So thank you all. It's been a fun journey. But let's go ahead and get to the topic of today. We just had a chance to listen to Bishop Reinhardt's conversation talking about immigration. I'm wondering if there's anything that immediately stood out to you.
Yeah, I mean, so many things, because he is an acknowledged expert on this topic.
Truth.
But the very first thing that struck me was right when he was talking about scriptural references about migration, and that he went to the Pentecost narrative and the story of all those diverse people with diverse languages. And one of the things that I think sometimes is a little problematic is that in our scriptural understanding of migration, we a lot of times paint it with sort of a sad face that, you know, people are leaving because they have to. We owe it to people to minister to them because everybody knows what it's like to be lonely and far from home. And what he was saying was diversity is something we celebrate. Diversity should be a source of joy. And I think fundamentally reframing the faith community's understanding that we're not just ministering to migrants because we feel sorry for them. It's because we are thankful for them and appreciate the way that they enrich our lives. So we hope that we can enrich theirs in response.
This is definitely one of those areas where many people in the faith community don't have to work really hard to look to Scripture and find a guide for how we should treat our migrant neighbors. And I feel like last legislative session, a lot of people were geared up for these conversations. They were ready to talk about migration and how we treat immigrants. And it really didn't come up too much during the last legislative session, but about 15 minutes afterwards, it started. Yep. But this really has been a federal issue and hasn't been addressed, at least during the last couple of Texas legislative sessions at the legislative level, right?
Well, that's right. And that is not to indicate that the apparatus of state government isn't paying attention to it. So while it is true that immigration is properly thought of as a federal issue, here in Texas, unfortunately, our administration has made a number of moves over the past few years and across more than one governorship, honestly, to consolidate a base of operations to make enforcement of federal immigration laws into a state activity, a state object of expense, which is something I think we're going to talk about a lot next session, and a way to drive a public narrative that then in turn makes Texas aim certain kinds of messages toward the federal government that could in the long run really hurt what could be generational change in our federal immigration system at a time when we really need it. So Operation Lone Star is the current incarnation of the militarization of the Texas border by Texas state government. The funds that are going into $10 billion in funds over the past several years that are going into providing weapons, personnel, equipment to ostensibly protect the Texas border from encroachment by hostile migrants coming across from Mexico. That particular program is using resources that are specifically intended in legislative appropriations for healthcare, for food, for improving transportation, for improving education. And saddest of all is that the place in the state that is in most need of real significant investment in those human services, health, education areas is the border area. It's just not the same part of the border. While everyone's focused on the wall and the river, actually miles and in some cases feet from the wall and the river are Texans who need those services and supports and won't get them in part because the money is going to fight a boogeyman.
So as we're preparing for the next session, do we think that in terms of immigration here in the state legislature, is it going to be mostly a budget issue, or will we need to have conversations about things like busing people away?
Well, even busing people away ultimately is a budget issue. It's costing a lot, and it's costing us money, and then it's costing the people who receive the people when they get off the bus money. So I think there's going to be a lively conversation about the busing, but I do think it will be couched in financial terms. I think all of this will be couched in financial terms in the very short run because it's a very concrete way to talk about it. I think the larger issue of what really, though, do we think our immigration and system of welcoming people should be like really is properly addressed in Congress. And right now, what we are hoping through the programming that we do, for example, Courts and Ports, our border journey, what we hope is to equip voters so that when there are opportunities to talk with members of Congress about migration, we're able to share with them real stories of what goes on here in our state.
On the budget issue, how do you frame that? And I asked the question like knowing how I would answer it, so we'll start there. I was talking with a family member last week who their church used to do a lot with a state school in North Texas, and found out that state school is no longer doing a lot of the programming the church used to partner with them on because they've diverted so much funding to Operation Lone Star, and that was sad for those
Sure.
folks. But how would you frame that if you're meeting with your representative about the budget pieces of this?
I mean, I think the most compelling thing always for meeting with a legislator is to be able to tell stories about yourself, your experience, people you know, programs you know that happen in the district that you live in. So going and talking to your state house member or your member of Congress or any elected official about, I don't like a thing that's going on somewhere else that I don't really interact with very much, never seems particularly personal. But if you're able to say, I'm concerned about this because here are needs that I see unmet in our community, or I see the expression of this policy in our community. So ways to think creatively about that are, it's not just a question of what we see as inhumane, unfaithful way of approaching people who have come to the United States looking for shelter. It's also harmful to the people who are doing the job often. So if you know someone who is serving in the National Guard, who is fatigued, who feels like they are, stretched thin and having to participate in this thing that's politically, at least controversial and doesn't seem to be affecting change, you should talk about that, and don't strain over parts of the puzzle that you don't know. That's one of the great things about our faith community is each individual one of us doesn't have all the parts of the story, but we are a big family, and collectively we know a lot of the story.
Yeah, Bishop Reinhardt, no surprise given his history as past board president of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, shifted toward the end to talk about what churches can do and talked about refugee resettlement and opportunities there. Certainly an area where you have spent some time thinking over the course of these years, and especially given our nature as a group that represents denominational bodies and faith organizations. So anything to add to that piece of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Bishop Reinhardt is an expert on the refugee issue and is a known advocate at the federal level. Here in Texas, unfortunately, we have done a lot to undermine the refugee resettlement program so that if we really had 200,000 refugees, with Texas being probably a major destination for them, it would be tough for Texas refugee agencies to gear up, and they would need all the support the faith community could give them. So we should be prepared to do that. Texas, a few years ago, and kind of with little fanfare, abolished its state-level Office of Refugee Resettlement. So there's no state agency coordinating the efforts of the local refugee resettlement agencies. That's a shame, and it has led to loss of staffing and inefficient use of resources and inconsistent communication with faith communities who really would want to help. I think that it is also not just a question of how you can help locally, though. We do talk about think globally and act locally. Well, when the faith community thinks about thinking globally, we can really put faces on that. We have missionaries, we have ministries and programs all over the world, including in the countries that are the sending countries for a lot of migrants. So one of the things I would really encourage people who listen to this podcast to do is to figure out how to be in connection with the missionaries who are serving your denomination or tradition in those sending countries. See if you can get them to Zoom in, or see if you can get them to, when they are stateside, do a presentation for you and your group. They are the people best positioned to tell us as Americans in our faith communities here in Texas, for example, what they are seeing around the world. And we should take advantage of that and really maximize the value of that resource.
All right, Bee Moorhead, thanks for the time today. It's been good having you back on.
Well, thank you, and congratulations again on the big 200.
Yay, happy birthday, or not happy birthday, happy 200th.
Happy 200, right, Scott. Bye.
I want to thank our guests today, Bishop Mike Rinehart and Bee Moorhead. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. And I hope you'll plan on tuning in and sharing this series with your friends and networks. We're excited both about the guests we have joining us and the content we'll be covering in the coming weeks. And remember, the goal of this series is to have Texans of Faith consider these priorities and give you the tools to have conversations with your representatives and candidates for office about these priorities. Texans of Faith, now is the time to engage, and we hope Weekly Witness is a tool for you to do so in a meaningful way. If you have questions or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. And leave us a rating or review and leave a comment for us in the feed. We want to hear from you, and we want even more people to find us, so work that algorithm. So with that, I think we'll close out our 200th Weekly Witness episode. Make sure you're subscribed and sharing, and go ahead and check to make sure you're following Texas Impact social media. Then head on over to texasimpact.org to make sure you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact and supporting this important work. Friends, election season is upon us. Now is the time for Texans of Faith to lock in and consider what we're planning to do in the next few months. The world needs Texans of Faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is Bee Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.